Imagine if a government had the power to do more than just punish crime. What if it could actually invent criminals? What if it could label an entire people, men, women, and their children, as criminal from the day they were born, and then rewrite their history so completely that even their own descendants believe the lie? Well, let's dive into this really unsettling story from colonial India.
So, get this. This is what descendants of a community called the Yerukula believe about their own past today. Seriously, it's this story of them being criminals who were saved, rescued from a life of sin by missionaries and factory work. And it's a narrative they tell with total conviction.
But here's the thing. Historical records, and a lot of them were written by the British themselves, tell a totally different story. You see, before they were labeled criminals, the Yerukala and communities like them were actually respected travelers, skilled artisans, and performers. They were a key part of the local economy.
And that just begs this huge question, right? It's really the question at the heart of this whole explainer. How does a community forget its own past? How do they end up embracing the exact story their oppressors wrote for them? To figure that out, we have to get inside the mind of the British Empire.
The first step in this whole process was, well, it was a diagnosis. Before you can cure a problem, you have to define it. And back in the 19th century, the British had a really specific and frankly prejudiced way of looking at people who just didn't fit their mold.
What you're seeing here is so important for understanding their worldview. Thinkers at the time, people like Thomas Carlyle, they literally saw society as split into two different races of people. You had the settler, who was civilized, moral, someone who builds things, and then you had the wanderer. To them, the wanderer was almost animal-like, lazy, untrustworthy, and with, lax ideas of property.
And to make all this prejudice sound official, they latched onto this popular pseudoscientific idea of a hereditary criminal class. The theory was that being a criminal wasn't because of poverty or your situation in life. No, it was in your blood. It was a genetic trait passed down through generations. This was the perfect intellectual excuse to go after entire communities, not just individuals.
So, they've diagnosed the disease as this hereditary criminality. Now they needed a cure. And their cure? Well, it came in the form of one single, absolutely devastating act of law.
It was called the Criminal Tribes Act, or the CTA. It was first passed in 1871, but by 1911, it had been expanded to cover all of British India. And this law gave the colonial government this incredible power over millions of people, not based on anything they did, but simply based on who they were.
I mean, just try to wrap your head around this number. In just one region of India, the Madras Presidency, 1.4 million people fell under this act. That's a massive population, bigger than many major European cities at the time. This wasn't a small-scale thing. It was a legal framework for controlling huge groups of people. And the way they did it was, well, it was this cold, bureaucratic cycle. First, your entire community, everyone you know, gets notified as being criminal. Then every single member, we're talking men, women, even kids, had to register with the police. You were watched constantly, and you needed a special pass just to leave your own village. And for many, the final step was being forcibly moved and confined in these special settlements.
And who was put in charge of running a lot of these settlements? The Salvation Army. This quote right here, it perfectly sums up their mindset. While they were a religious group, their founder was seen as a superb man of business. So you get this strange mix of missionary zeal, but also this very pragmatic, business is business approach to saving souls. They actually came up with a word for what they were doing. Criminochirology, the cure for the crime disease. It sounds like something out of a sci-fi novel, but it was real. They treated human beings like a science experiment, sorting people into categories, like the incorrigibles and the would-be good.
All right, so let's dig into how this so-called cure was really anything but. We've got to peel back the layers and deconstruct the fundamental lie that this whole system was built on. So, the entire justification for the Criminal Tribes Act, this whole house of cards, is built on one single idea, that communities like the Kauravas were, as they put it, addicted to crime. But were they really? Let's actually look at the evidence.
This is where it gets really incredible. The official charges were basically fiction. They were accused of aimless wandering, But their own records showed these groups followed fixed, predictable trade routes every year. They were called lazy because they weren't working for wages. But in reality, they were independent craftsmen and traders. And the big one, inherent criminality. In many areas, their crime rates were actually lower than the settled populations.
In fact, the real irony here is that the British basically created the very problem they claimed to be solving. Their new monopoly on salt, it destroyed one of the main things these groups traded. The new railways, they made their traditional transport businesses obsolete overnight. New laws about forests cut them off from the materials they needed for their crafts. They weren't born criminal, they were being systematically impoverished. So the first plan, the first solution, was to force these traders to become farmers in special settlements. And, predictably, it was a total disaster. The land was often terrible, but there was another big problem. Local landlords hated these settlements. Why? Because they didn't want these newly labeled criminal tribes becoming independent farmers. They wanted to keep them as a pool of cheap, controllable labor.
Okay, so Plan A, farming, was a bust. What's Plan B? Industry. The Criminal Tribes Act essentially got a new purpose. It became a machine for supplying a captive workforce to private, British-owned businesses. People from the settlements were shipped off to work in mica mines, cotton mills, and sugar factories. And for the employers, it was a dream scenario. They got a workforce that, by law, could not strike, could not leave, and couldn't ask for better pay.
All of which brings us all the way back to that haunting question we started with. We've seen how this idea of a criminal tribe was built and how these people were controlled, but how on earth was their real history just erased from their own memory?
The key was to create a whole new story, a new folklore. Take a look at this. It's from a poem the Salvation Army published around 1916, and it's written from the perspective of a Crim. Notice that first-person confession, I am a Crim. They were literally teaching people, through songs and stories, to see themselves as fundamentally broken.
Now, fast forward about 10 years. The poem was updated. And look at the change. The I has become a we. It's not an individual confession anymore. It's a group project. The community is now being taught to identify with their reformers, to join in the mission to rescue the Crim. The new story was taking hold. You have to imagine generations were born and raised inside the walls of these settlements, cut off from the world under constant discipline, and fed this new history day in and day out. The result was a total cultural break, a kind of collective amnesia that just severed the connection to their actual past as proud traders and artisans. In this prayer, this really tells you everything you need to know about why that new, false history could grow. It was planted in the soil of absolute terror. When your daily life is a desperate prayer to be saved from the government and the police, you might just grab onto any story, any narrative that promises some kind of salvation. Today, that awful law, the Criminal Tribes Act, it's gone. But the stigma, that label, it's still there. These communities are now called denotified tribes, and they're still fighting the shadow of being branded as criminals. It leaves us with a huge and frankly very relevant question that goes way beyond just history. What happens when a state becomes so powerful that it can't just write laws, but it can actually rewrite memory itself?